Hello, and welcome to Stuck in Limbo, Struggles and Successes with Microsoft Graph API for Automated Email Access into Office 365 with Brian Wells. I'm Bernie Bernstein, a developer in the Service Management Group here at Do It, and I'll be moderating today's session. Please note that we will be recording this presentation, and an accessible video will be available for viewing on the IT Professional Conferences website in the coming weeks. I'd like to introduce Brian Wilt from Computer-Aided Engineering.
Hello, hello. So this is the API talk into O365. Excuse if you can hear it, there's a neighbor doing some tree removal, so I wasn't planning on this, but we can make do as best we go. So kind of the situation that I wanted to talk about is it has to do with email. Who reads that stuff? We have a thing called Request Tracker in the College of Engineering. It's a business application that we've had since the 1990s. I say we, I was not a part of engineering at that point. The main purpose is for ticket tracking. So if there's any kind of problems or requests, our help desk operates through the Request Tracker application. So students, faculty, staff, if there's instructional or research needs, then we handle it mostly through Request Tracker. Emails are the primary data driving object. So if an email gets sent in, that automatically creates a ticket. If we respond on the ticket to send something back to the requester, that becomes an email that gets sent back out of the application as well. This is a college-wide service. There are multiple groups in the college that use the application. So different departmental support queues. We have some support queues for software, we have some for research, for the network, for hardware, different kinds of operational areas. So Request Tracker is actually kind of a large application that we run. I think there's about 30 different queues. And each queue actually also contains multiple email addresses. So some email addresses will funnel into the same queue, for instance. So you might figure out that it needs to be able to receive incoming messages and also send them back out. Outbound isn't too much of a concern. We used to run our own email servers on in the engineering college. We converted to O365. Outbound email at this point is currently handled by some allow lists over at Do It. I think there's 2 or 3 servers that we say these are the ones that need to be able to send email out. But inbound email is kind of another story, and that's the topic that we're going to be getting to. So with email, you should probably authenticate. It's good to know that if you send an email to me, Brian, that I'm the one who can log in and fetch it. So you might remember in the last couple of years, Microsoft has been pushing for modern authentication. As somebody who's studied English literature in the 20th century, I didn't know that the 1920s were coming back around. I'm waiting for postmodern authentication to come out from Microsoft. But regardless, it does increase security for the average user. It helps to reduce the chance of password leaks, helps to prevent brute force attacks. There's a Microsoft provided web endpoint that many of you have probably seen. It's got some pastel colors. It'll redirect you to login with SkiDU. And then that's how most people are going to log in to get their email or their calendar. And most importantly, it allows for the inclusion of MFA to the stack. So a lot of people can be protected by using the Duo to guard against bad actors and stuff. So this is all well and good. Nothing wrong to say about this. But what about service accounts? There are things on campus that aren't human that handle email. And there are legitimate business needs like Request Tracker, where we need email to occur without any human being present. So we need this service to be able to both send and receive emails without a human operator. And if there's no human operator, well, you can't really do MFA. So what do? So this is a search for new solutions. I'm going to briefly mention what we were doing before, how it looked, and then what we have moved to now since about last summer is when we put the new solution into place. So in Request Tracker, there's kind of a lot of things going on, but very specifically, we're just looking at inbound email. We formerly used a program called FetchMail, which would log into O365, and it would use POP3 over TLS. We had this just on a cron job, and we had a password file with each mailbox and its account password, and it would, for each account that we had in that file, it would go ask O365, hey, is there new mail for this mailbox? These were retrieved and then passed on to ProcMail. We did a little bit of spam filtering, a little bit of encoding. Sometimes Cyrillic or Chinese encodings would break our application. So we had some things put in place to filter some of that out. And then it would deliver it finally to a Perl script, which was part of the RT program. And then that would create a ticket in a queue somewhere. So that fetch mail part, that's the thing that needed to go away because we can't do POP3 anymore. It's not kosher. So we need something to be able to go get email and then pass it on to a program on the RT host. And ideally, this would be a program that we would have daemonized on a server. And it's running right next to the same web server as the RT application. Luckily, there is an API for that. So on the right, there's just some, in the next few slides, there's going to be some examples of the code I have. Microsoft provides what they call the MS Graph API. It is a RESTful interface. I actually was just now being told by a colleague, like, there's some other things. This doesn't have anything to do with GraphQL. There's no like node and vertices or anything like that. It's just a RESTful interface that happens to be named Graph. And this can be used for automated or non-user facing access into Exchange. So in front of the Graph API, I needed to configure something in Azure. So in the UW-Madison Azure instance, I have an app registration. And this is what allows us to authenticate into MS Graph. So you'll notice, if you can see my mouse, I'll hover. There's a config with a client ID and then a client credential config secret. So the client ID is what we say, this is the UW-Madison Office 365. So it's a long UUID. And this is UW-Madison Exchange that I want to connect to. And then the secret in the config is for our app registration in particular. We use secret tokens for authentication to Exchange. Azure allows us to generate one to associate with the app registration. You could also use things with the Graph API at Microsoft that would just use credentials from an end user, but we can't do that here because that would need the MFA. But you could write an application that would basically sort of maybe mimic Outlook in some way and fetch user emails if they put in their own user and password and did all that stuff. So how do we mimic the workflow of fetch mail to get stuff into ProcMail? Again, this is just another example of some of the code I wrote. We need to have a mailbox ID, and then we also need that access token. So we're not going to do a cron job and re-authenticate every 5 minutes. This is just a background daemon. Once we use that, from the previous slide, once we use that secret token for our app registration, we're authed. And it can periodically fetch a new access token if it needs it. It'll check if it's expired or not, and it has a cache. So on startup, it'll authenticate with Exchange, but then it will automatically refresh if it has to. And then after we've authenticated, if we have that access token, then the response that we get back from the Graph API will, in this instance, we can do the request for all the messages in an inbox, and we get a UUID for each one. And then we should be good programmers and make sure that we didn't get a bad response code. Yeah, make sure that we actually got what we intended. Otherwise, it just might look like junk. So how do you configure this mail fetching script though? Just JSON. So I have just a large nested JSON blob as my config structure. So all the relevant bits are key value pairs. The ones at the top, the authority, the client ID, and the scope and the endpoint, that's for mostly how things are set up to talk to Graph. The client ID, again, is like the identifier that says I'm trying to talk to the UW-Madison O365. And then also, oh, I think I left it out, but the secret token is also in the configs, and it's another UUID. And then we have a long nest of queues. And so these are each of the individual queues in RT. I think there's about 30 of them. So for each of those queues, we will have both a correspond and a comment. And then each of those will have a mail address that we need to fetch emails for. And so then that mailbox, we need to provide, I think it's the UPN, user principal name, is what it's called inside of like Azure AD. And then there's also an object ID, which is another long UUID that we give to Graph, and we say, give me the messages for that mailbox. So we can iterate through all of those, each mailbox and each queue. One of the nice things that we took the time to redevelop when we were making this new integration was that previously fetch mail might throw its hands up and die, and you'd have some nasty cron output in your emails. You'd have to go kick the bucket or tell it like, hey, restart trying to get your emails. But we implemented just a little skip feature. If there's something that has some bad encoding, we'll just mark that UUID in a variable and we'll skip it on the next iteration. So what kind of problems came up? And this is getting into the meat of what I wanted to discuss today. What kind of roadblocks did we end up having to face? So initially I had worked with building the fetched message as a JSON object. So it seemed like that was kind of the middle of the road. Most of the time when the developers or when the documentation for developers was discussing how to get your email, you could like ask for it as a JSON object. I was trying to deconstruct it. There were some info that I needed to get, like the subject and who the sender was. Those were important for routing into the request tracker application. Trying to like unmarshal, get the info, and then remarshal it again back into an email message turned out to be kind of complicated. And then I found out, hey, Microsoft actually just lets you grab it as a MIME encoded, just plain text file. And that's actually ends up being what RT and procmail work best with anyway. It's what fetchmail used to do as well. The app registration in Azure, that's the thing that we log in like as, that's the entity that tries to get the emails. We're not signing in as each mailbox anymore, right? So previously we'd been logging in as this queue, and then we'd log out, we'd log in as this queue and then log back out. But what happens this time is that we need to log in once and then ask for a whole bunch of mailboxes by an ID number. The only problem is we need to be able to give that permission to the app registration. We need to be able to give that permission to the app registration. So I had to work with the O365 team and do it to say, hey, so there's 30 queues. There's actually 140 different mailboxes. So it's a little tricky to say, hey, we've got all of these mailboxes and I need to be able to have the permissions on all of them. Just some other notes. I'm very much a novice when it comes to the sort of Azure Microsoft realm, but in case this info is useful for you, the app registration, I had to set it up for public client flow instead of private. And then there's also the specifics of how it's allowed access to each mailbox is called the delegated API permissions. So there's application level permissions, but that ties into if the end user was authenticating, like say with Duo, with its own password, then you could get into the mailbox that way. But we're not trying to log in as the mailbox user, we're trying to gain access administratively. So that's where the delegation comes in. So I had to work with an AD admin to grant permissions. I am an administrator for certain email related things for the college, but I do not count as an admin in O365. So it took quite a bit of communication, negotiation, scheduling times for some meetings and stuff to try and figure out how to do this. Ultimately, I believe what happened is that there were some PowerShell commands operated against the campus AD. And we also have, I hesitate to call it a group, but I believe it's a group of AD object UUIDs that are allowed permission that this app registration for the request tracker is allowed to access those mailboxes. And so that's how the connection is made. So it's kind of a confusing middle zone is what I want to say. The College of Engineering is in some ways an organization that is both too big and too small, at least as far as this specific problem for emails and for O365 is concerned. As much as we might like to, we can't just run our own O365 instance. If we could run something separately from campus, and then I could have administrative access to the Exchange instance. Unfortunately, I can't do that, and I don't really want to. But the business needs of the college, well, this isn't just a 2-bit penny ante nickel and dime kind of operation. We have thousands and thousands of undergrads, and we have a massive research operation going on. So we can't just have maybe 2 or 3 people with a shared mailbox. We need a beefier application to be able to handle the kinds of requests and ticket tracking that we have. So we have a lot of mailboxes. Hello, chat. So that's where we come into needing to have the delegated access. And it would be nice if we could find a solution for this sort of confusing middle zone between being big enough to have large scale business needs and workflows, but being too small to be able to directly interface with the administrative rights in O365. So from the point of view of Microsoft, it's almost like this is a problem that they weren't expecting. Restricting the scope of the app registrations isn't particularly straightforward. It's not something that the web portal allows me to do. It's something that the O365 admins found they could do and did for me. So from the point of view of Microsoft, they would sort of assume that if I belong to some, company or an organization and I'm writing a business application, why wouldn't I also be the admin and just let it see any email address that I, would need to let it have access to? Kind of another question then is, at the UW, who do I go to for support on this, right? I'm being required by my job to make sure this business application is running. So if I go talk to Microsoft, they're going to tell me, well, you're not an admin for O365. Why should we talk to you? You don't have any authority over your instance of Exchange. If I go talk to Do It, they may tell me something similar, that this isn't an application that they support. It's something I'm trying to do on my own. So there's definitely a need to play very nicely with others. And you have to do a lot of legwork to figure out what do you need, why you need it, and explain your case whenever you have a chance to talk to somebody. So just wrapping up, I'd like to go over just a couple of points. Some of the key takeaways and summaries that I want to have you guys remember is that modern auth requires modern solutions. And it is actually a pretty interesting piece of software that they've developed. The Graph API, it does work really well. So far, we haven't really had any issues with it, with the delegated permissions. And there's UUIDs for everything. There's a lot of tokens and secrets. We identify who UW is by a UUID. We have a secret token, which is also just another UUID or a string of characters. I like to chuckle to myself after hours that the long passwords that we had for mailboxes over POP is pretty much the same as a long UUID that you'd give to Graph API. You give it a name and a password, or you give it a name and a token. But the workflow is subtly different, and it is a bit more secure. But I like to gloss over that and just chuckle that this isn't really any different than it was before. But I want to really stress that communication is the best tool you have with colleagues and across campus units. This wouldn't have been possible to do without communicating with other people and having those sort of political negotiations, if I can use the term. There's not really self-service tools for me to be able to make those kinds of operations, or even request that those kinds of operations be done in O365. And there's kind of not really sort of a sort of multi-tenancy setup in O365. There's not, apparently there's not an easy way for me to say anything in engineering that has something in O365 is something that people in engineering should be able to handle. So it's definitely a big, important thing to be able to make your needs known and also work with others to get things done. So that's why I'd like to say, even though the technical aspects of the MS Graph API were fun and interesting to figure out, a big part of the process was really just a political one of finding out who I need to talk to, going through the Do It Help desk, going through back channels on Teams, and yeah, probably the lion's share of the time on the project, which was 3 or 4 months of trying to work on this, was really people skills at the UW, because the technical is not all there is to it. So with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Brian, did you see David Parter's chat? Or
I did. So I can answer that. So of the various options that we had for deciding how to move forward if we can't do POP into, or if we can't use POP against O365 anymore, definitely one of the things that we thought about was we had just recently retired a bunch of mail servers, and we had thought about, well, we could try and revive those and run a rogue shadow email service on campus. I think the idea of having least complexity involved was at stake. If there was a solution that was sort of deemed appropriate by Microsoft, that this should be feasible and we should be able to do it, I decided to pursue that first before I wanted to revive more cattle to care and feed for, or more servers that I'd have to manage, and more like systems that I might get questions about. Why are you running more mail servers when we have a mail service on campus? So, okay. Any other thoughts or questions?
also say that I found this very interesting because I recently just did the very same thing, and I stole code from someone that was doing an RT transition to Office 365. Now I'm only doing 2 email accounts, so I just logged in as those service accounts and store those tokens and manage those too. But I can understand why with hundreds you wouldn't want to do that.
Todd, I can answer that question. The list of addresses is fairly stable. We get requests from different departments. So there's a professional development group called Interpro in engineering. They asked for a couple of queues to be made a couple of about a year ago, I'd say. So I did have to add those. Then there's also another research lab that had, I think it was, they had some shared mailboxes, and we converted those into queues in RT, and it was about 5. So it's kind of just like a once in a while, maybe once every couple of semesters, we may have to update the list. And so then I reach out and say, hey, can we adjust this? I have the object ID and the Azure user principal name, UPN. Just say, hey, can you add these to the list? I don't think I've had to remove any yet, but if we do, I could reach out and say, hey, do we need to, can we adjust the list, by removing some? That can take some time. So it's, it's also not self-service. It's kind of something I'd have to wait on somebody and do it to respond to. So it may take a couple of days depending on their workflow or if they're out of office. So. I do notice what you said, Departer, and I think that's that's something we've hit on quite a bit, and we can talk about that. I do think perhaps it's out of scope, and there are totally other solutions that could have solved our issue. But back to Todd. Similar to how do you store track the secrets? So the way that we store, there's one token in particular that's really important, and that's the app registration's secret to be able to tell O365 that it is who it is. The object ID for UW-Madison, I don't think is too important. It's kind of like just having a username ID or a user ID, like a numeric ID on a file system or something like that. We previously, we store it the same way that we do now. We had our config management system have an isolated set of secrets that we would only copy out to that server. So for the rest of our code, most of the config, the nested JSON of all the queues, That's just stored in like our Git repositories. And then when we template that out, then we take the time to take the placeholder and replace it with the secret token. So we don't save that into our code repos or anything like that. We make sure that it's, you know, secure. So I don't think we've had to look at expiry yet, but that might be over the summer. I actually think I need to see if the app registrations token, it might have been a 12-month token coming up in July. So I'll let you know how that goes.
Well, I'm not seeing any more questions.
Okay. Hopefully that was interesting. And yeah, feel free to reach out if you have any questions. You know, I'm on Teams or I've got my email on there. I'd be happy to talk to people more if you have questions later on. So.
All right, I'll go ahead and stop the recording.
Okie dokie.